Norman Tebbit, the Tory grandee and a member of the Telegraph family, has died at the age of 94. I will be talking to Charles Moore about Tebbit's life and his legacy.
He was in considerable personal pain and suffering in that sense, ill for quite a long time and weakened, physically weakened. Ultimately, that was less important in the whole story, including less important to him than what had happened to his wife Margaret, the other Margaret, as she was sometimes known, because she was paralysed for life and lived for 35 years onwards, and therefore required constant care.
Lord Moore, Norman Tebbit was born in 1931 to a working-class family near Enfield. He really embodied Thatcherism, didn't he?
He did, including not only in his background, but in his character, because his character was the sort of character which he admired, which is to face adversity boldly and to be honest as you rise in the world about your background, not to be ashamed of it, and indeed to see it as a source of strength. And I think from that background, he brought a sort of directness which would be harder in a politician from a grander social background, and a lack of apologetics. So he was sometimes traditional conservatism has felt a bit bad about itself, if you know what I mean, because it's connected with privilege. Norman Tebbit didn't see it that way at all. He was a vigorous conservative, and he wanted the benefits of conservatism to distribute much more widely. And he was himself a beneficiary and exponent of that conservatism. And that was extremely powerful politically.
For people who may not have been around, they might think the Conservative Party has always had a Thatcherite philosophy. It hasn't. And in the early 80s of Margaret Thatcher's first cabinet, she really had to fight very hard to get her ideas implemented. And Norman Tebbit had a critical role in that, didn't he?
You're quite right, he did. And particularly critical in that year when he made his famous speech about getting on your bike, because he'd just been put in the cabinet the month before. All the wiseacres, 365 economists had written to the Times to say that the Thatcher experiment was a failure and all the rest of it. And the 1981 budget had been extremely controversial, and Mrs. Thatcher was being destabilised within her own party by the so-called wets. So Tebbit arriving on the scene for the first time as a cabinet minister, he'd been a junior minister, really made a key difference at this point. And you could hear that new voice very powerfully.
Well, let's just listen to that voice. This is from the 1981 conference.
I grew up in the 30s with an unemployed father. He didn't riot. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he kept looking till he found it.
Listening back to that, to be precise, he wasn't telling the growing ranks of unemployed, it's all your fault. He was actually responding, wasn't he, to riots that were going on. He was saying, rather than rioting, try to find work and improve yourself.
Yes, I mean, in about sort of 10 words, he said everything that needed saying, really.
Yeah.
He located himself in the story because of his father's history. And he explained how his father, in difficult times, did not take those difficult times as an excuse for violence and revolt, but as a spur to doing well. The Brixton riots were very unpleasant, violent riots, but they also were taken by a lot of the sort of chattering classes to be the natural result of Thatcherism, that people were so persecuted that they were bound to take to the streets and smash windows. And Tebbit was giving a completely different account of that and standing up against that in the most sort of compact and concise way with personal authenticity.
He was critical to the fight against the unions, critical to the early stages of privatisation, and after the 1983 election, one might have thought he had a very bright future, possibly even Prime Minister. Then there was the Brighton bomb, and earlier I spoke to Philip Johnston, who remembers covering the bomb because he happened to be in Brighton at that conference when he was a very young journalist for the Newcastle Journal.
Well, it was very early in the morning, funnily enough, and it was the last day of a very hectic conference season. The Conservatives were always the final conference. And so it was about 3 o'clock just before 3 on the Friday morning. And I'm afraid to say I was still up. It was one of those occasions where we were out rather carousing, really. And I was standing on the doorstep of the Metropole Hotel, which was next door to the Grand when the bomb went off. It did seem at the time like it was a car bomb because there was lots of dust and debris outside the Grand, and I ran towards it and then thought better of it and went back and actually went to file a story. I mean, there were plenty of people around to help those who were lying around in the street, and I went to file. I was working for a regional newspaper group at the time. I think we were one of only 3 newspapers to have the story on the front page the next day, largely because I was still up.
Right.
And I spent the rest of the morning sitting on a wall opposite the Grand, looking at the debris that just scattered into the road and onto the beach, while a procession of politicians, activists, cabinet ministers came wandering out of the Grand and then into the Metropole, which was then evacuated when the police realised that that might have a bomb as well, of course, to go off a bit later. I can remember sitting with Sir Keith Joseph in his silk dressing gown on one side and Grey Gowrie in his silk dressing gown on the other side of me on the wall. And then at about 6 o'clock in the morning, I think, it became apparent that there were attempts were being made to rescue a few people from the front of the hotel. And I went back to my own hotel, which was quite close by, the Sheraton, and turned the television on. And that very moment was when they brought Norman Tebbit out on a stretcher.
Right.
From, between the floors that had collapsed.
Someone said to the firemen, "Well done, lads." This has been an exceptional rescue by the firemen, by the ambulance teams, and by the doctors who've been here at the Grand Hotel. Mr. Tebbit looks in a bad state, but he is alive, and he's now going off to hospital.
And his whole life changed at that point, even though he himself was not, in the end, debilitatingly injured. His wife was.
Yes, Margaret.
Excuse me, Margaret was, yes. And he had to spend the rest of her life until she died a few years ago looking after her. Yeah, there was a moment when we were in the neighbouring hotel and we thought there might be a sucker punch. And of course nobody knew at the time that this bomb had been put there 6 weeks earlier.
By the IRA.
By the IRA, of course. And of course, I think Simon Heffer made the point in his piece in the paper this morning that when Norman Tebbit went shooting subsequently, as he fired at the pheasants, he would say, "That's one for Adams and that's one for McGuinness." He obviously never forgot, and I don't think he ever forgave, and why should he?
Lord Moore, after the bomb, Norman Tebbit's wife, Margaret, was very severely disabled, and he also had injuries too. What effect did it have upon him personally and upon his career?
The first thing, I think, which was sort of underplayed because he wanted it underplayed, was that he was in considerable personal pain and suffering in that sense, ill for quite a long time and weakened, physically weakened. Ultimately, that was less important in the whole story, including less important to him than what had happened to his wife, Margaret, the other Margaret, as she was sometimes known, because she was paralyzed for life and lived for 35 years onwards, and therefore required constant care. And he had the enormous burden of her care, and by the way, the expense, because this was by no means wasn't paid for by the state, and the worry about it. And I think that in a way that when someone you love suffers because of something in which you're involved, a sense of guilt, and also a sense of thwarted ambition, because he did want to go right to the top. And he sort of knew, or he half knew, that this was now very unlikely because of what had happened with the bomb. So he hadn't got the ambition quite right out of his system, but he knew he had to help his Margaret. And I think this was a very painful thing in every way. He dealt with it very admirably, but not without internal struggle and exhaustion.
Margaret died in 2020. Norman had one last significant job in government or in the Tory party, which was chairman of the party from 1985 to 1987. Now, what's interesting about that, if I'm right, is that the arch-Thatcherite came into some conflict with the Prime Minister.
Yes. In the 1987 election, which actually the Tories won extremely easily, Mrs. Thatcher was very, very nervous. It was her third general election as leader, and she was always nervous about elections. The polls almost always showed the Tories ahead, but she didn't really believe them. And she wasn't very happy with Norman Tebbit. She conceived the idea, and of course the chairman is supposed to run the election, she would conceive the idea that he perhaps had ambitions of his own against her. And I think this wasn't 100% untrue, though I think it wasn't really likely to happen. But there was a sort of, you can see how Tebbit might be thinking about this a bit. And she thought he wasn't running it properly, and central office wasn't being run properly. And also in the way that she used to do if she was panicked about something, which wasn't very often, but did happen, she would sort of blame who was to hand. And Norman was to hand. And though she greatly admired him, and he was a true Thatcherite, I don't think they were personally all that close always. And I don't think he was one of those charming flatterers who she rather liked, these rather sort of smoother characters, like Cecil Parkinson, in fact, who had been an earlier chairman. And Parkinson and Tebbit were both friends and rivals. So there's quite a lot of sort of emotions going on in here. And she had the most tremendous stand-up row with Tebbit in the middle of the 87 election when she thought it was all being mishandled. Right. And it was called, and a poll came through which was unsatisfactory, and she was suffering from an abscess on her teeth, and the whole thing was for a very short time, very bad. And Tebbit was angry about it, and he felt that he was being misrepresented by people in her court, as it were, and was fought against Lord Young, who was also part of the campaign and so on. Fundamentally, it was trivial, actually. It didn't prevent the Conservatives getting an overall majority of 100, and it didn't fundamentally break the link between Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit, but there was signs of tension, I think, which were real and were to do with both their personalities.
Did victory not lead to a reconciliation?
It did after a bit. Norman Tebbit then retired not from politics, but he refused government posts. And then when Mrs. Thatcher was threatened with the leadership ballot of November 1990, she asked Tebbit to come back and offered him the post of Education Secretary, which he refused for the same reason as he refused other things, which was his Margaret and her condition. But what he did do, and he did very well, but it was too late, was campaign for Mrs. Thatcher in that ballot. But unfortunately, the whole thing, her campaign was poorly run, and she was in Paris on the key day when people voted, and probably the seeds of revolt had been sown earlier, so it wasn't successful. But Tebbit was the most prominent individual Conservative actively campaigning for her in that election, and he did it with his usual vigour.
Listening to what we've discussed, difficult economy, terror attacks, prime ministers who look outwardly as if they're in control, but privately they're falling apart. It's striking how familiar so much of this stuff is. But also so many of the issues are the same. And one wonders in conclusion, what do you think Lord Tebbit, well, you might have known what Lord Tebbit thought of where the Conservative Party is today?
Well, he was always on the right of the party, and he was always Eurosceptic. And I think he actually articulated very well things that have been more crudely represented by reform, because, and it was part of the skill of the Tory party in those days that they could contain those views and more left-wing views without having a horrible dust-up. And what they suffer from now is the horrible dust-up that came later. So that people have felt they had to divide about all this. And by the way, psychologically, this goes back to the overthrow of Margaret Thatcher, because there's a lot of bad blood about that. But Tebbit was not hard right, I wouldn't say, but he was tough. And clear, and he hated ambiguity and sort of messing around. And he brought that edge to Toryism, which it needs, and partly in class terms as well. But in his day, this was never a way of splitting the party. But that knack has been lost now. So the party did split in effect. I mean, not literally, but that's what the development of reform is all about. And it's hard to put the pieces back together again. I never talked to Norman Tebbit about what he thought about reform. And indeed, he was, by the time all this came along, he was very old and not at all well, but he did maintain a sharp mind. But he wasn't aiming for what's happened. He wasn't aiming for a Tory collapse or a new party to arise. He was aiming for a party strengthened by Brexit, in which he always believed, and which is an opportunity which unfortunately was not taken in the right way at the right time.